It's also interesting that the way that it was often being interpreted when people explained evolution, they talked about tool use, weapon use, etc. In a sense, they described the ascent of man largely in terms of his ability to control and kill less fortunate human beings or other species. Now, it's interesting that more recent views of the evolutionary process, partly based in anthropology, suggest that it was the development of cooperative behavior of families, of communities, etc. When I first heard the concept in anthropology, that the reason that people learned to walk on 2 legs instead of 4 was so that they could carry groceries home. I thought that they were being, I thought they were kidding, but that's a serious concept. One of the really interesting things along this line, Meave Leakey, who was the curator of the National Museum of Kenya and was one of the people in finding this neurocotomy boy, who is the oldest sort of complete Homo erectus skeleton, about 1 million years old. And a lot of times when you hear about the discoveries of skeletons, they're actually talking about a few little bone fragments, and then from that they're reconstructing. But this is a virtually intact skeleton of about a 12-year-old Homo erectus that lived 1 million years ago. Now, not all anthropologists agree with Leakey, but what she was saying is that this Homo erectus skeleton was of a severely handicapped child, that there was severe scoliosis, that this 12-year-old could not have hunted or gathered, etc. And her interest in this is that what she suggests is that this actually demonstrates that there were families and communities at that time, because this individual could not have survived without that. So it's interesting to see that at least in some cases now, and maybe some people would say this represents the feminist entry into science, that rather than whether or not you can manipulate an electric drill or Colt 45 is no longer being seen as the critical thing, but whether you can engage in cooperative behavior, etc. And in fact, one of the very clear things in terms of the development of intelligence that I think everybody agrees with is that part of the ability of humans to develop a higher level of intelligence is based on having infants that are born where their central nervous system is not fully developed and has a couple more years of development. And this means that unlike a horse that can get up and walk around and eat on its own, hopefully, shortly after it's born, that human beings, in order for survival of the species, depend on caregiving, etc. So, but certainly the idea that we had of evolution at that time tended to focus much more on a harder kind of competition. And finally, I would talk about intellectualism. And Galton, as some of you may know, some of you may be familiar with this notion of rating people on how good-looking they are on a scale of 1 to 10. This was another invention of Galton. And Galton went around England on the trains with a little card that he poked pins into, rating everybody on whether they were 1 to 10, etc., and concluded that Scots were the ugliest people in the United Kingdom. Please don't take that from me. That was Galton's conclusion on a scientific basis. But the point that I want to make about this, I think, well, some of us might engage in saying that person's a 10 or that person's a 2 or whatever. I don't think many of us today see that as a highly scientific process. What I want to point out is that when Galton was starting his work in intelligence, intelligence, beauty, athleticism were all seen as concepts which were kind of vaguely defined. I mean, people agreed that you could be more intelligent or less intelligent. People agreed you could be more beautiful or less beautiful. But interestingly, with intelligence, we actually decided not only could we have a 10-point scale, we could have a 100-point scale. And that we would be able to measure intelligence as a unitary factor. I think right now, if we try to measure athleticism as a unitary factor, basketball players would have one idea of what athleticism was. Hockey players would have a slightly different idea of what athleticism was. If we tried to say that there's one, instead of a G, as we have in intelligence, as the one central core of intelligence, that there's one central core of beauty, and it might play out in different ways, etc., I think people would feel uncomfortable with that. But I think all of these are concepts. Nobody denies that there's such a thing as beauty. Nobody denies that there's such a thing as athleticism. And I don't think, I certainly wouldn't deny that there's such a thing as intelligence. But the idea that this is a discrete single characteristic that can be measured as one particular number that characterizes an individual didn't exist at that time and was starting to develop largely through Galton's work and the people who followed him. So we had, at the same time, these family degeneracy studies, or virtually the same time, and I'll talk about them a little bit more. And there were permeating racial and class structures, both in the roots of eugenics that came from Galton and the UK, and also in these degeneracy studies that started at least in the United States. Interestingly, the Jukes, the first family degeneracy study, was officially published in 1877 when Dugdale says he discovered the Jukes. However, it had already been in the New York Times but in 1874, not necessarily called the Jukes, etc. So the Times were on the ball as usual, talking about these groups of families and particularly about Margaret, the mother of criminals. I mentioned to a group of people yesterday, they're very proud to have discovered that my ancestry actually intersects with the Jukes, and who were, at the time, if you read the New York Times, the principal moral failing of the Jukes was intermarriage. The proof that they were morally inferior was that they intermarried with Indians and blacks, and that was particularly a problem even in New York State at the end of the Civil War in a lot of people's minds. Interestingly, the word Juke, although nobody really knows where it came from, Dugdale never really talks about that, none of the others actually talk about that, is a Gullah word. And some of you may know the word jukebox. Okay, juke is an African word that in Gullah and many African languages that means wicked place. And so what happened was during slave days and after the slave days, there were places that people went to drink and dance, etc., that were not sort of the official pubs, etc., often out in the woods, hidden places, etc. And those were the places that grew into what were called jukes later on. And when they came up, they often didn't have bands, and when they came up with these automated machines for music, those were the first places that they were installed, and that's where the name jukebox came from.